Hello friends, this is DarkScream and welcome back to the PTR. This will be the third set of Paladin talents we're going to test. You can really see things starting to take shape here. Why don't we take a look? So, a bunch of changes this week. They're filling in the capstones, finally. So now the physical presence no longer just gives you a flat, giant buff to your physical damage, which is probably good because it was quite strong. So now it gives 10% to Holy Strike abilities. Remember, Holy Strike is physical and holy, so I guess it has to be both. And you get a stack of physical presence. After you get 50 stacks, you get a proc. In testing, this seems pretty cool if you're doing a single target rotation. It doesn't go off on Divine Storm, because Divine Storm does holy damage, not Holy Strike, so that's a bit of a bummer. Blades of Light, so I remember mentioning these should get combined or switched or something. Look what they did. Ends up, that's pretty much what they did. So they took Crusader Strike, Judgment, Hammer of Wrath, and your single target Holy Power abilities. So any finisher that only targets one target, like Final Verdict, Justicar's Verdict. We still have our spinny hammers on Education. Change here for Vanguard of Justice, so it now increases the throughput of the finisher to the appropriate amount of increasing the cost, so we've gone ahead and done some build. Big change is, so we remember our Crusading Strikes, our auto-attack Crusader Strikes, is pretty hype. We now have Templar Strikes, so they got rid of Blessed Hammer, which really didn't quite fit, but now you can see why it was there, because it was 3 charges. So what this does is it makes Crusader Strike into a 3-part combo. When you press Crusader Strike, the button changes into a different button. And then when you press that second button, it changes into a third different button. Nearest comparison I have is probably like Druid's New Moon, Half Moon, Full Moon. Kind of works like that. However, the radiant damage part of the talent doesn't seem to be active, and all you really get out of this is 3 Crusader Strikes in a row. Crusader Strike's not exactly the most favorable ability to press, but it does feel very different, so we're trying out some talents with it. Not too much changed on the fire side. This still just deals 10% extra fire damage. Now, they mentioned they have an idea that maybe it could stack up something and do a burst of damage, but that's what the other side already does. It's kind of lame. So what I'm thinking this should do is this should replace Hammer of Wrath with the removed Exorcism, right? You take this, fire damage increased by 10% as well, and it'll replace Hammer of Wrath, so you'll be able to pull Exorcisms out on Execute range, or Final Verdict will activate it. I think that'd be perfect. Another idea I had was maybe a dot. Maybe something like when you crit, you leave a dot. It rolls like Ignite. You could make some kind of gameplay there. They changed this talent a bit, so now Holy Crusader makes your Blade of Justice and Expurgation holy damage. Burning Crusade makes your Divine Storm, Divine Hammer, and Consecration radiant damage. They swapped around this so you get 10% crit on Judgment. Not a very exciting talent, to be honest. I think that about covers all the major changes here. They did a bug fix, so if you have the Divine Auxiliary talent, this will now count as a generator, which triggers other things like Dusk and Dawn. And I guess this wasn't actually increasing stamina, this wonderful talent, Sanctified Plates, but they bug fixed that too. You know, I didn't notice that because I literally just don't test it. So, why don't we test out some builds? So the first one we're going to try is the Crusader single target. So we've kind of split. We're either leaning left into the Crusader side, we're leaning right into the Ashbringer side, or we've got a weird, funky hybrid build. The Crusader single target is going to be running Templar Strikes. We've got extremely reduced Crusader Strike, which I don't know how I feel about this, but this build, at least how the rotation works out for me, seems to fit together. So why don't we test it out on the rating dummy? Here we go. So, we'll go ahead and build up our 10 stacks of Crusade here. You can see we've got our extra Crusader Strike. We also need to go up to 5 Holy Power in order to get our finishers. Oh, we're not using Crusade on this build. That's right, we're using Might, so we can just blast. We do have to build up 5 Holy Power, so we can't quite get as many finishers in Final Reckoning. Alright, why don't we go ahead and fast forward this for 2 minutes and see how we do. Alright, that's 2 minutes. So about 55, 60k is where all these builds land. I misplayed this one a little bit, but we can still look at the damage breakout. So we have our final verdicts. We're running the 5 Holy Power version, so the big hits are quite big. With Final Reckoning, I find Final Reckoning does better than Execution Sentence. Hammer of Wrath always crits. We still have that going on. It also procs Blessed Hammer, so you can see a little bit of extra damage there from the Hammer of Wrath that can be added in. We have our Judgment. Looks like Judgment and Divine Toll's Judgment have been split, so the Judgment that deals more damage is from Divine Toll. You can see that only happens once a minute. Still, Judgment, a pretty significant portion of our damage, and then Crusader Strike, Templar Strikes, and Templar Strikes. Yes, there's 2 different abilities called Templar Strikes. So all together, we ended up having a Crusader Strike that added pretty similar damage to Crusading Strikes, right? If we add this up, that'll be an even 14%. If you want to count the auto attack damage in there, because that's what Crusading Strikes would do, 18%. So what I'm finding is you always have a button to press with this, which is kind of cool, right? You can see it in the replay here. You just tap, 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 tap to get your triple strike, and that really helps you build up to the 5 Holy Power to do the 5 Holy Power finisher. All in all, it feels a little different, feels fresh. Alright, next up we have our Ashbringer single target. So this one's stuck with the Crusading Strike, so we're not going to have to press that button. We're also not pressing Consecration either, that'll be happening automatically. This build deprioritizes Hammer of Wrath just a little bit because we want to keep our Expurgation dot going. We're really periodic damage focused on the Ashbringer build. We also have our big Wake of Ashes with our big Truth's Wake. We run our Execution Sentence, so the idea is we Execution Sentence, we hit our Wake of Ashes every 30 seconds. Nice pop-off every 30 seconds on a single target. So let's see how it feels. So we want to get our 10 stacks of Crusade up. We're at 7, we're at 10. Next we want to try to build up to the Holy Power, Execution Sentence, start pumping. Start pumping. Alright, let's fast forward, see how it does. Alright, that's about 2 minutes. So yeah, see the damage is coming down here. We were a few thousand points higher than the previous build. You can see in this build we had some fat execution sentences, 300k. Can't crit, but oh my god. Looks like Expurgation coming up ahead, actually ahead of the Blade of Justice itself. So you can see, except until the very end there, I kept my Expurgation going always. It's pretty, I think this will be ideal, kind of work within your rotation a little bit and just keep the damage up. Blade of Justice, you can see my timing, so right in the middle I slipped up, I let it go 3 segments, whatever a segment is. You can see I kept my Blade of Justice pretty consistent. I was hitting it like every 5 seconds, which keeps a nice smooth Expurgation dot. Now Crusading Strikes, so remember, this would take up the damage from my auto attacks as well as all of those Crusading Strikes, and it's only about 9% of my damage. Now, I haven't spec'd into it as heavily, and of course this is single target, it works out a bit different on Cleave, but on single target, I felt there were a couple times where I had dead GCDs, and I was really hoping that Final Verdict would reset Hammer of Wrath to keep my rotation going, basically. So I don't know how I feel about Crusading Strikes on a single target. You may or may not have enough GCDs. Once again, we see our Divine Toll versus our regular Judgment. Looks like our regular Judgment actually hit more often and did more damage for this build. That's interesting. Hammer of Wrath, pulling it out when we can. Truth's Wake and Wake of Ashes. Yeah, Truth's Wake does a lot of damage. It does more than Wake of Ashes itself. We had some free procs on Divine Storm on our 20-second timer here. So all in all, I like how this build feels. But before we move on to the Cleave, we do have one more, and it is the hybrid single target. So the hybrid single target, it goes to both capstones, because it looks like now that they've changed this around, I can make my Blade of Justice Holy, I can make my Crusader Strike, my Judgment, my Hammer of Wrath into Holy Strike. This build did end up playing the Templar Strikes, so we're going to be tapping that. However, we went into cooldown, but not extra charge, and we put the extra charge on Blade of Justice. So this makes a rather unique rotation here. Now, it doesn't get any of these nice tools in the middle, including the defensive, so obviously I don't know how realistic this build might actually be, but, you know, that's an optional defense. You don't have to take it, right? So, this build's much more straightforward. It pretty much just pumps its plain builders and spenders. Let's see how it does. I believe we're running Crusade as well. Yeah, we're running Crusade as well. Alright, let's see how we do. Templar Strike. So pop wings. And we're running the 5 spenders as well. 2, 3, spend. 2, 3. Alright, let's see how it does. Okay, coming up on 2 minutes, and actually, this build significantly outperformed the other builds. Look at that. Yeah, that's 5-ish more 1000 DPS, so let's take a look at what happened here. We have our physical damage, physical presence procs going off for a little bit of damage here. We have our Templar Strikes. So this is what I mean by Templar Strikes actually kind of being alright. It's a little bit lower damage here because I did deprioritize it, only doing 13k a hit. Generally, Judgment is going to get you more per GCD. Blade of Justice is going to get you way more per GCD. But you can see here, I didn't quite manage my expurgation dots as well. Yeah, there are a couple times I let that fall off, so expurgation probably could have been more than Blade of Justice here. But pretty straightforward, right? We have our Divine Tool Judgment, our regular Judgment, our Hammer of Wrath, our auto attacks, some automatically proccing Divine Storms. Nothing crazy, right? No fancy tech. But just the straight damage abilities, just pumps. The one thing I noticed was I was really glad to always have Crusader Strike as a filler and going into Templar Strikes. You seem to be able to press it once, and then you have one GCD to press something else. So you can, like, Crusader Strike, Templar's Verdict, Templar Strike, right? It's always there, and there's also no problem with how I've got it set up. You can see the cooldowns are really low, 3.2 seconds. So the original charge cools down while the secondary and tertiary abilities are on screen, which is really neat. Basically means Crusader Strike is always there. It's basically never not on cooldown. So you can let it go, right? If you only need 2 Templar Strikes, you go 1, 2, you don't press the third one, you can let it reset, and it'll still be up, you're not wasting it. So kind of cool. Interesting, the hybrid build with the double capstone seems to be overperforming. Or maybe I just played it better, who knows. So with that in mind, why don't we flip over to the hybrid AoE. So the hybrid AoE, I went the other way with the build. I went with the big cleaving tools in the middle. We've got our Final Reckoning, and we've got our Wake of Ashes. We have no capstones, so we went with the sub-capstone. So we'll have our Blessed Hammer proc, we'll have our bigger crits on Divine Storm, and we have all the standard tech, right? We're dropping Consecrations, we're cleaving with our Blade of Justice, applying the dot, we've got periodic buffs, we've got free Divine Storms building up, and our Crusader Strike cleaves. Notably, I've dropped the Judgment cleave. It's kind of where this build ended up, so I dropped a lot of the abilities that buff Judgment as well, kind of just letting it be a debuff ability. We'll see how this plays out. So this is the hybrid spec on Cleave. Alright, we've had to look at the rotation. Let's fast forward and see how it does. Okay, coming up on 2 minutes here. One thing I noticed is you can see it here, I'm running into some dead GCDs with this build. It feels really good during Crusade, but outside of Crusade you have idle time, which I tend not to be a fan of. We were doing around... We were a little higher before it started counting down. Finishing number coming in around 150, 160. A little bit lower than I would have expected. Looks like we're getting our Expurgation as Radiant and our Blade of Justice as Physical. So some of this is not, new talent's not hooked up yet. Yeah, Consecration is Holy and not Radiant. Truth's Wake coming in at a pretty significant chunk of our damage. We ran Incandescence since we have Consecrations going. We had our final Reckoning coming in, and we just had some good chains of Divine Storm during those final reckonings. A little bit of Blessed Hammers damage, not too much. So the hybrid build, this one maybe could still use some fine-tuning. It felt like it didn't quite have the right amount of abilities. We had some idle time. Let's see how the next one performs. So we have 2 more. We have our Hammer Cleave, or Crusader Cleave, and we'll do an Ashbringer Fire Cleave. So Hammer Cleave here. The idea behind this build now is to make sure, now that Sanctify buffs Divine Hammers, we're going to try and hit our Divine Hammers on cooldown while cleaving. We've got the periodic buffs, we've got Expurgation, but we're going into the physical presence, so once in a while we can throw a Templar's Verdict to proc this, because unfortunately it doesn't proc off of Divine Storm. This one's also running Crusading Strike, so no pressing the button. Alright, here we go. You can see our physical presence builds really fast. 40, 50, we have the Templar's Verdict. So the way this one seems to work is you do your normal AoE rotation, but because your Blade of Justice hits so many targets and your Blessed Hammers hit so many targets, especially from the Hammer of Wrath, you get a lot of physical presence stacks very quickly. I've been forgetting to press Divine Hammer, so why don't we fast forward and see how it goes. Alright, that's about 2 minutes. Significantly lower, look at that. 133k, not great. So I guess one of the things to note about this build is it seems like the Holy Strike path is more single target oriented, so you throw a final verdict. Eventually I stopped doing it. Yeah, if you throw a final verdict in the rotation and you can proc your physical presence, which does a little bit of damage, it's pretty good. I don't know, maybe run this with Empyrean Legacy, maybe you just don't worry about it. Another thing is Divine Hammers, so I started to remember to press it halfway through. So if I pressed it consistently, it would be about double that, so it'd be up here. I found Divine Hammer typically does about the same damage as Consecration, so they've got it pretty well tuned. My only concern there is you either don't spend a talent point at all and you have regular Consecration, which would do about the same amount of damage, or you spend a talent point to get Consecrated Blade, and then you don't have to spend a GCD to get the Consecration damage, which is really good. So I feel like Divine Hammer needs a little more oomph to be worth it. Just, it's not quite there. Not quite there. One nice thing about it is it does generate a Holy Power, so it does feel nicer as a filler. This build did have a couple of those dead GCD moments, but then I just pressed Divine Hammer, so it wasn't a dead GCD after all. Hammer Breath still going only on a single target, but it's worth pressing because it procs Blessed Hammers, and this also gets you a bunch of physical presence stacks every time it deals damage, right? And Blessed Hammers kind of flies around and generates those stacks, which is kind of cool. And we still have our Expurgation. We can see here our Crusader Strike cleaving. Really good. So Crusading Strikes with the cleave on seems very, very, very strong. It did seem maybe a little weaker on single target, depending on what build you're running, but oh boy, is that a lot of cleave, right? It almost did as much as Divine Storm itself, so that still seems quite strong. It's even stronger than Expurgation now. Part of this, even though it's coming up tooltip physical, I suspect it's actually getting the Holy Strike conversion and dealing more damage because of that, maybe. So, could be something there. It's hard to tell when, you're on the PTR and you don't quite have accurate tooltips. You just have to go with what you see. Alright, last but certainly not least is the Fire Cleave. This is our Ashbringer AoE. I have high hopes for this build. So, to review, we stuck with our Crusading Strikes, because as we saw, Crusading Strikes with Blessed Champions is very strong. But we did not go with Judgment Cleave. We are going entirely Consecration, Wake of Ashes, all periodic damage. Actually, I haven't mentioned this yet, but almost all the builds you've seen today use one rank of High Lord's Judgment. I haven't, two ranks of High Lord's Judgment, I haven't found a build where that feels right, where you're not wasting it. However, this is really, 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 really nice. It's so much damage, and it lets you almost play a style where you can prioritize Judgment or not based on whether the debuff is there or not. Who knows what will be correct once people sim things out, but I'm talking about the game feel, and it feels good. So, point of this build is to pop off with big Final Reckoning, so you want to use your Wake of Ashes on cooldown, once with Final Reckoning, once without, and then you have that kind of every other relationship with Crusade. So we're going for big Haste. Haste will accelerate the amount of damage, of Expurgation. Sticking with Art of War, even though they nerfed it, I still think it's better in general, even on single target, but at least the way this is lined up, it kind of looks like you're supposed to use Righteous Cause on single target, Art of War on multi-target. I don't know. Maybe I'll test this a little more, but so far it feels like Art of War is just better. Alright, Ashbringer AoE, probably the most similar to Retail Paladin. Here we go. It's nice, you can see the Consecration happens automatically on Blade of Justice now, so no more 40% chance. It does have an internal cooldown, but basically it means your Consecration is always up. Really nice. Alright, let's go. So I kind of screwed up the rotation while I was talking there, but you can see it's starting to come back together here. So we want to get our stacks up, drop our Final Reckoning. There we go. Alright, let's fast forward, see how it does. Alright, that's about 2 minutes. We're holding about 170, so I think this one might be slightly better, or it's about the same as the hybrid AoE. No big surprise there, since both of those builds pretty much have the same middle of the tree taken, so it feels like this is where all the AoE damage is. However, since one of our biggest AoE damage is Radiant, we have a fire damage buff, it definitely still seems like the fire side is more AoE oriented. Both of them have options though, and definitely different playstyle feelings to it as well. Now, there is one more build we can look at. I'm not going to test it out, but I included this in the notes last time, and I'll do so again. This is the one I called the World Questing spec. So you can see here it's got Fading Light, it's got Crusader's Reprieve, it's got Blessing of Protection. It's much more of a defense-oriented build. We're running Justicar's Vengeance for the healing. What the goal of this build is to basically be able to solo rares in Forbidden Reach. It's part of the PTR, right? So, if you want to get out there and actually test the content on the PTR and not just the talents, I figured I would include this one. You can find all of these builds. I will link them in the comments of the video. And with that, we've come to the end of this week's PTR testing. I really do think they're getting close. They're not quite there yet. There's still a couple of things not working, not hooked up, not finished. What I'm hoping to see is number one, I want to see that new mobility thing they said they had in development. I don't know if we'll ever see it or not, but I certainly would like to test it at least once. Number two, I would like a different spender. I would like Radiant Decree back as a spender, especially if you spec into the bottom right side of the talent tree, what I've been calling the Ashbringer side. Number three, I would like to see Exorcism come back. I think, again, for the fire side, you could replace Hammer of Wrath with Exorcism as one of those talent changey dealies, and that would fit very thematically. Number four, I'm still not super happy with Retribution Aura. It doesn't look like it's going to get a change, but if I could, I would give Retribution Talent Tree specifically a unique utility or unique buff that nobody else can provide, that you can't just pull in a Prot or Holy Paladin for. It also doesn't have to be something that's mission critical, right? It could be something like Spell Warding. Remember when we had Blessing of Spell Warding back in beta? That might be good. Number five, I really, really like both Crusading Strikes and the new Templar Strikes. Templar Strikes does need something to give it a little more oomph. It says it's going to deal radiant damage. Maybe that's the thing. It doesn't seem to be dealing radiant damage quite yet, though, so it didn't feel beneficial. But if I could, I might actually make more of a reward for staying in the combo. So right now, all three strikes do the same thing. It's 3 copies of Crusader Strike. What I would like to see is maybe the second and third strike could deal more damage, generate more holy power, cause a proc for something like a dot or a direct damage hit or a debuff or something. There just needs to be some payoff for locking yourself into all 3 GCDs of it, because I found myself more often than not, I would have 3 holy power and everything else on cooldown, so I'd tap it twice and then do a finisher, and by the time I was done doing that, I didn't want to hit the third hit of it, so I think that would be really beneficial. If you've enjoyed this PTR coverage, remember to hit that like, smash that subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Again, my name is DarkScream. Peace.